organization calling itself the Center for Freedom and Prosperity recently posted a video hosted by a fellow named Dan Mitchell of the Cato Institute. The video features a discussion of what he calls the RAN curve, or RAN curve. Effectively, the RAN curve is a graph that shows on the x-axis increases in productivity, and on the y-axis the percentage of GDP that government is taxing out of people's pockets and spending into the economy. The argument made is that maximum economic growth, maximum productivity, is achieved when government spending is approximately 15 to 25% of GDP. This raises a number of issues. The idea that there is a proper size of government, together with the idea that the percentage of GDP being spent by the government is a measure of its size, or is the way in which we determine its size, has certain implications. In particular, it implies that as GDP increases, government spending as an absolute number should increase. So actually what we're having here is an argument that government should continue to increase in size as the economy grows. This from an organization that says government's too big. Second, in speaking about productivity, Mitchell is necessarily speaking about the productivity of all people considered in the aggregate. He's not speaking of the productivity of any given individual. Therefore, by talking about what is actually a measure of overall productivity increase, he's necessarily saying that overall productivity increase is what matters, as opposed to the increase in productivity of individual human beings. So he's saying that what matters is the greater good, not the good of any particular individual. And building on what I just said before, what he's actually arguing is that it's in the interests of the greater good, or it's for the greater good, that government continually increase the amount of money it takes from people and spends on whatever it spends on. In other words, that it fixes taxes and spending as a percentage of GDP. Now, what are the implications of fixing the amount of taxes that you're going to collect and spend as a government as a percentage of GDP? Government spending as a measure is itself ambiguous. Nowhere in the video does Mitchell discuss what that money is being spent upon. Trade implies that no person is being deprived of his property without getting something that he wanted in exchange. So for government to spend our money to protect us from those who would steal our property or restrict our liberty is to facilitate trade. And if you're facilitating trade, obviously productivity is going to be higher than if you're inhibiting trade or allowing people to steal instead of to trade. But what if government doesn't use the money it collects from us, that ideal 20% that it would collect under Mitchell's system to protect our life, liberty, and property? Law enforcement is neutral. It's not necessarily good and it's not necessarily bad. It depends upon the law that's being enforced. And so at the very same cost to government, an officer can do something that would be helpful to productivity or something that could hurt productivity. So for example, an officer could prevent someone from being deprived of their goods. In other words, they could prevent a mugging. But the same officer could instead be charged with the duty of making sure that stores don't open on Sundays because it's a day of rest. Or an officer could be charged with the responsibility of going to farms where milk farmers are selling their milk directly to individuals rather than buying quotas and selling only to government-approved milk marketing boards. You know, the police officer could go there, shut down the farm, seize the property, kick the farmer off his land. That is not going to increase productivity. Money spent by government is not a measure of whether government is doing something that will increase or decrease productivity. You can't simply say that there's an amount that increases productivity or decreases productivity. It depends upon what the money is being spent upon. Here's another example. $1.8 million could be used to fund 6 judges for an entire year in Canada, who could then put away muggers and rapists and thieves. Or it could be used to buy this. Clearly, if we're spending that money on judges so that we have fewer thieves on the street, fewer muggers on the street, fewer people inhibiting trade, we're going to be a lot more productive than if we use that money to buy 3 lines on a wall. Individual freedom means freedom from those who would take your values without your consent, who would end your life, restrict your liberty, or take your property without your consent. Individual freedom does not mean maximizing the productivity of the country. It does not mean redistributing wealth from those who earn it to those who do not. Yet all of these various non-governmental functions are implied by Mitchell's and his center's recommendation that government spend a certain fixed percentage of GDP, that it collect that amount of money from people and spend that amount of money. That suggestion implies that it is right to redistribute wealth, that it is in the interest of the greater good, that the people who produce more should pay more, and etc. All of the various things we've talked about. This is not freedom. It's economics. It might even be helpful toward finding out what increases productivity across the country in the aggregate. But it is not freedom that is achieved by pegging the amount of taxes and spending at a percentage of GDP. Rather than finding economic arguments as to what a government should be doing or not doing for achieving some economic end, government should keep in mind that it has only one appropriate end, and that is ensuring that justice prevails, ensuring that no person is deprived of property without his consent, etc. Similarly, the notion that small government is desirable is equally fallacious. A small government that does absolutely nothing to defend life, liberty, and property is certainly not better than a government that is bigger, that does limit itself to defending life, liberty, and property. It's not the size of government that matters, it's what it does. What is, therefore, the correct size of government? Well, it might be big, it might be small. In a country where everyone's quite moral and they don't engage in murders and rapes and thefts, obviously the price of government is going to be lower. You will need fewer people enforcing the law if more people are already obeying the law. But if you've got a morally corrupt society in which murders and rapes and muggings are the way of life, obviously government is going to be a lot more expensive because people are engaging in immoral activity. So there is no one right size of government. There's only the size that ensures that your life, liberty, and property is defended. Now, if neither economics nor the size of government have anything to do with individual freedom per se, why is it that libertarians so frequently make economic arguments for freedom? What is it about economics that attracts libertarian movements and parties? Well, economic arguments are inherently quantitative, not qualitative arguments. They talk about how much of something there is. They don't talk about the nature of what is. Economists don't talk about whether something is moral or immoral per se. That's not a basis for quantifying anything. Instead, they talk about how much of something will be produced if some other amount of something else is increased or decreased. They're optimizers, they're engineers. Economists are dealing not with the quality of things, but with the quantity of things. And libertarians, by focusing on quantitative differences rather than qualitative ones, can bring together people who have very different qualitative opinions about right and wrong, for example, and bring them all together according to quantitative arguments. So, for example, a libertarian group can make quantitative arguments in favor of smaller government that might attract the pro-lifer, because he wants government not to spend money on abortions, and he figures that smaller government wouldn't spend money on abortions. At the same time, the quantitative argument for smaller government might also attract the pro-choicer, on the ground that the pro-choicer doesn't want the government giving tax breaks to churches or giving subsidies to religious programs to cut down on crime and etc., because those churches might be using those funds to advocate for the prohibition of abortion. So here you have two qualitatively different groups of people, the pro-choicers and the anti-choicers, both being drawn together by the desire for smaller government, each of them thinking that smaller government will achieve their view on the qualitative difference. The pro-choicer thinking, well, you know, smaller government means we'll have a pro-choice country, and the pro-lifer thinking, well, you know, smaller government means we'll have a pro-life country. So they're both trying to achieve opposite ends by the same means within the same group. It's a obviously self-contradicting group. It's not a group that can achieve freedom in any quantitative or qualitative sense, because actually its membership is utterly in disagreement on everything that defines what freedom is and why it's necessary. The anti-choicer thinks that the role of government ultimately is to prevent people from making choices with their body. The pro-choicer might be in favor of people having choices over their body, or they might only be limiting their pro-choice attitude to the issue of abortion, and might at the same time be arguing that nobody should be allowed to smoke marijuana. And in all likelihood they are that inconsistent within libertarian circles, because that's the whole gig with libertarians. They don't have to agree on anything fundamental and qualitative. They only have to agree that they want less government. And so economics gives them the quantitative arguments about why less government, defined quantitatively, is more economically feasible or desirable, but leaves completely unanswered all of the little divisive issues that are really the foundation of either oppression or freedom. The moral issues, in other words. Now, nothing I've said should be taken as, saying that economics is useless or not a good field of endeavor. Clearly, economics has told us a great deal, but it's most properly used not by governments to achieve economic ends. They should not be achieving economic ends. The only right end of government is justice. Economics is of use to private individuals, private corporations who want to make economically sound decisions with their own money for their own ends. Not necessarily, unless they are, self-sacrificial for the greater good, but to maximize their own productivity and their own wealth. Individual freedom, if that's your goal, cannot be founded upon quantitative economic arguments. And the reason is, as soon as you advocate that government adopt some economic goal or aim, they're already using force to interfere with trade. They're using force to redistribute wealth, to set tax rates differentially, or etc. All of the various things we've talked about. They're interfering in the free market if they have an economic aim that they're using guns to achieve. Economics is not a tool for government, and it's certainly not a way of achieving individual freedom. The only essential reason for advocating freedom and for advocating a government that defends individual freedom is that your own survival and happiness depend upon the freedom of individuals to think rationally, to act upon their decisions, to make the values, to produce the values, to create the values, or to trade for the values upon which their survival and their happiness depend. Economics is a personal tool to help one achieve that end, but it is not a tool for government, and economic ends are never the ends of government properly considered in a free society.